If you're ever in Canterbury or its surrounding areas, I suggest you stay away from Clowes Woods. It's fairly small and remarkably unexceptional compared to some of the other woodland in the area, so most people tend to avoid it. This made it the perfect place, or so it seemed, for an impromptu camping trip for me to get away from it all. It's actually quite dense woodland when you get right into it, giving you that feeling of utter isolation from the rest of the world. However, there's a reason why Clowes Woods has been left nearly untouched for decades, and why the locals choose to avoid it. Hell, the road leading through it hasn't been used in so long that it's been covered in overgrowth, but we'll get to that later. The day had dawned, the car was packed, and the drinking had begun. Of course, as is the way with most things, the journey wasn't as smooth as one would have hoped. The road which leads through Clowes Woods was actually a lot worse than I had anticipated. It was in a state of complete disrepair, with weeds and brambles completely covering it. I had to leave my car in the closest spot I could find and walk the rest of the way, which wasn't easy with the gear I had. This really was a laborious task. The forest was thick and unforgiving, leaving me scratched and bruised from my battle with the foliage. I had a small knife with me which I used to hack through the brush, but it was still a challenging task. I was beginning to get a bit nervous at this point. I had never been camping by myself before, especially not in the middle of the woods, but I decided now was as good a time as any to prove to myself that I could do it. In preparation, I watched 20 episodes of Bear Grylls the night before and figured, hey, if he can do it, why can't I? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Clowes Woods is very quiet, almost silent in fact. You'd expect to hear birds singing and local wildlife going about their day, but there was nothing. It seemed as if I was the only living thing in the forest. It was a hard feeling to shake, but I stayed rational and convinced myself that I was just being stupid, so I kept going. As luck would have it, after only about an hour's walk, I managed to find a great clearing to set up in. It was probably about 30 feet in diameter and almost a perfect circle, with one solitary tree off to the north, just breaking the line of other trees. There was also an interesting rock formation about 30 feet away from it. It looked like some sort of scepter. It had a large black spherical rock atop a long black cuboid. I marveled at it for a few seconds before moving on. I decided to set up and camp here. Darkness was creeping in, alongside panic at the very thought of having to set up my tent blind, so it seemed like the best spot I'd find. I'm not even sure what time of day it was. The forest canopy was so dense that hardly any light managed to seep through. Luckily, my tent was just a pop-up that needed to be pegged down, so it was set up in no time. I'll call her Lucy, I said to myself, chuckling. She was big enough to fit 3 men in as well. I giggled to myself for a while, cursing the fact that there was no one around to hear my spectacular joke. I then grabbed my chair, started a fire, and got to drinking. The tent was on my left, the fire was dead ahead, the place where I, relieved myself, was behind, with a thick tree line surrounding me. I still cannot believe how dark that night was. The darkness was suffocating. I'm not sure if it was because I was nervous, but I felt as if I was gasping for air. I couldn't see past the fire. I could barely even see my own tent for that matter. I tried to take my mind off of things by roasting marshmallows and listening to music, but lo and behold, my phone was dead. Have you ever experienced a silence so intense it's almost deafening? There was literally no sound whatsoever. I could almost hear my stomach digesting the marshmallows as I scarfed them down, desperately trying to fight off the panic that was beginning to overwhelm me, when suddenly the silence was broken by the rustling of leaves about 10 feet to my right. Dim lights appeared around the clearing. I'm not sure if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if it was just the embers from the fire. At that moment, I must have looked like a deer in headlights. I swear I turned my head so fast that I'm surprised I didn't break my neck. I was straining my eyes and craning my neck, trying to identify the source of the noise. The only reason I found it was due to it moving again. That's when I noticed the source of my fears. A tiny bunny rabbit hopping through the leaves without a care in the world. I breathed a sigh of relief, cleaned the metaphorical shit from my pants, and chuckled to myself about being such a coward. I didn't sleep at all that night. It was too dark and too quiet, you know? It felt like I was being watched. It's hard to explain, but it felt like at any moment someone, or something, would come crashing through Lucy's flap to ambush me. However, nothing came. My hand didn't leave the knife I'd placed under my pillow for 1 second. I was ashamed. I felt like a frightened child calling out to his parents in the night. I felt as if I needed to talk to someone in order to get out of my own head. I summoned all my courage and decided to stay another night so I could get over my childlike fear of the dark. It's a good thing I was already on my way to my makeshift toilet because of what I saw when I left my tent that morning. The rabbit, which was so merrily hopping around my tent the previous night, was dead. In fact, it had been cut in half and left at the base of the isolated tree. I couldn't look at it long. The mutilated corpse was making me feel ill. How could I have not heard it? It didn't make any sense. How could I have heard it hopping around but not getting sliced apart? Whatever did it must have been bigger than the rabbit, so surely it would have made more noise. I assumed that there was some sort of bird nesting in the tree, and it must have killed the rabbit. That was the only plausible explanation. I decided to kill time by having a look around the surrounding area. Like I said, I had never been camping before on my own, so I had no idea how to pass the time. So I decided to do some quick exploration. And what do you think I saw? You guessed it, more trees. There were a few interesting things though. For example, I had only walked about 30 yards or so before I stumbled upon a large, perfectly spherical black rock. It was about the size of your average football, and it was nesting itself atop a larger rock. This rock was similar to the first. It was black and smooth, but it resembled more of a cube than a sphere. A strange feeling washed over me. Had I got myself lost? This was an extremely similar formation to the one I had seen yesterday, but I had gone the opposite way from my camp. I ran back through the brush to where I assumed the formation was. Luckily, I found it and let out a sigh of relief, realizing I hadn't gone completely insane. I was intrigued now, though. I started wandering around the edge of the clearing looking for more of these formations. I managed to find 2 more. There was one to the north of the camp, one to the east, one to the south, and one to the west. I'll admit, I should have been more wary, but I thought nothing of it and moved on. Besides, the darkness was creeping in again, so I wanted to get back to camp. Darkness had fallen, and it was awful. I wanted to leave and go home, but I'd never find my way. The darkness enveloping my camp was thick and suffocating. The silence was back in full force as well. Something was different about tonight, though. It was hard to put my finger on it. I had this overwhelming sense of dread. The fire was much smaller than last night as well, so I felt even more blind. The feeling of helplessness was getting to me, and the panic was starting to take hold. I decided to face my fears and look around to see if there was anything interesting. You know, I've never seen an owl before, so I scanned the trees, seeing if anything at all caught my attention. As I was scanning the tree line, something definitely caught my attention. There was a dim light coming from the edge of the clearing, roughly 30 feet away from me. My peripheral vision just managed to pick it up. I strained my neck to see what it was, but unfortunately it sunk back into the darkness. I hoped, for some reason, it would be another person. My naivety was getting to me. Another speck of light appeared. I could only see it in my peripheral vision as I turned my head, but it was roughly 90 degrees away from where the first one was. Again, I turned to look, but I couldn't see it anymore. Wild thoughts started running through my head at this point. Were these people? What were they doing here? What did they want from me? I even began to wonder if it was the rock formations that were somehow emitting light. but I dismissed it. I had another scan of the tree line and my heart stopped. Something caught my eye. It was hard to make out exactly what it was, but I thought I saw a silhouette of a person peering out from behind the tree, the lone tree which I had chosen to camp with. As soon as I looked at it, it disappeared back behind the tree. I leapt out of my chair. My heart was racing, my limbs felt like jelly, and it felt like all the blood was rushing out of my head. I decided the best thing to do was to get back into my tent and try to get some sleep. As I turned towards the tent, I nearly blacked out. There was something peering out at me from behind my tent. Again, I only caught it for a brief second, but it was much closer than the last one. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a black, humanoid figure. The figure was darker than anything I had seen before. It seemed to emanate anger and hatred. I ran into my tent, pulled the sleeping bag over my head, and tried to sleep. I felt the warm glow of sunlight on my face. I opened my eyes in a daze and felt confused. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was, but I knew something was off. I was leaning against something. I felt a shiver race down my spine as I realized I was still in my sleeping bag, but I wasn't in my tent. I looked around, terrified. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it could explode at any moment. I could see my tent directly in front of me. The flap had been ripped open and my stuff was strewn around the clearing. In that moment I realized where I had woken up. As I turned my head towards the sky, my fears were confirmed. I sat at the base of the tree. I sprung up to my feet, blind with terror at this point. I saw one word carved into the tree above where I had been resting. Leave. Which is exactly what I did. Thanks for listening, and remember, you cannot hide from the void.